So, today we're going to talk a bit about the evolution of communities and the evolution of communications in the internet era. And as so many things did, we saw this massive explosion in evolutionary speed in society with the birth of the internet. And so it's useful to consider this period as a separate section from what came before. So, to discuss them, we're going to talk about several major phases of the internet. There are academic sources that talk about Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3 as kind of when the internet has gone through major changes. And then I'll also have a brief note about the early eras, the very beginning of the internet, and talk about two of the major trends that happened in the Web 2.0 era, which are prosumerism and mobile first. All right. So at the very beginning of the internet, or what we now call the internet, at the time it really didn't have a name. It was just this tool that they had access to. You were looking at research centers at CERN in Geneva, and then in several research centers in California and Massachusetts in the United States. Needing to share large amounts of information very quickly and needing to communicate between researchers in disparate kind of remote centers. And so they developed this new technology called the internet in order to facilitate exactly that kind of communication. This is noteworthy because the beginning of the internet is literally a community. And it flows very quickly into what we call the Web 1.0 era. This is the very beginning of the internet, the early 1990s, into maybe as late as 2000 or so. And Web 1.0 is really focused on email lists, forums, Usenets, and message boards. So we're talking about people using this information to share, using this technology to share information, but focused on primarily either professional interests or fairly niche hobbies. So you see some things like chess message boards emerge, or some political discussions begin, but it's primarily used as a tool for people professionally. And you're looking at small homogenous groups. So it's a lot of computer scientists, it's a lot of researchers, and there's a very limited range of conversations because it's only accessible by people who have access to the university systems that are maintaining the early internet, right? And evolving slowly out from that. But at the beginning, it's really only this very limited group. And the communication is largely via text. And there's a large amount of conversations that are anonymous or pseudonymous. So people are either not speaking under a name at all, or are speaking under handles and usernames rather than their own names. Now, sometimes, as you see in this example here, those can share with their actual username, but it was very quick to expand that out. Then there's the emergence of social media really marks the change from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. There are some proto-social media sites, but really the main social media sites that emerge are Friendster, MySpace, Facebook. These are kind of the first three large-scale social media sites. And along with this, you're seeing the widespread adoption of internet communication by the general population. We're no longer talking about a niche, small community. We're talking about everybody. There's a famous Time magazine title, "Here Comes Everybody," right? And that's the idea, that suddenly everyone can communicate online and it's widely open. And people start to create online identities, right? It's no longer about just your professional identity. It's about your online identity as a larger structure. And communications become more personal, more diverse, and deeper, right? People are talking more about their own lives and about a wider range of topics and in a deeper way than you had with the very small community in the early internet. You also start to see a wider range of media that's available. You see online video, photos, audio, comics, all of these things start to come in. And at that same time, you're seeing a growth of communities of interest in place on communities such as Tumblr, Reddit, Stack Exchange, and others, where people are sharing information about tools they're working with, hobbies they're involved in, etc. Right? So you're starting to see this large growth of that, and also about specific locations. So you may have cities, states, small areas developing these same tools, subreddits and tumblers and so on for them specifically. And because of this, you start to see the beginning of influencers, right? That you have kind of natural leaders emerge in those communities of interest in place. And those are really proto-influencers as we understand them today. The influencer thing really starts to explode later on, but this is the very beginning of it with this early Web 2.0 community. Now, one of the defining features of Web 2.0 is prosumerism. So the idea is that people aren't just passively absorbing information, right? They aren't just watching the video someone else posted. They're not just reading the blog someone else put up, but they are both consuming and creating in parallel, right? So you can watch a video on YouTube, record your own video, and upload it. Especially with early YouTube, that's the way it worked, right? We weren't talking about professional creators. We were talking about this very democratized access to tools and platforms, right? Now, everybody has a computer. You can buy a cheap webcam and use that to record your video like that. Same with audio, same with the use of Photoshop to open up visual arts to a wide range of people, right? And so people can absorb information, right, in a much more democratized way. They have a large access to information, but then they can also create it much more successfully. And this changes the dynamic of how information flows in society, right, which has an intrinsic impact on the nature of the communities around it. And there's this idea that you can read, react, share, remix, and create, right? All of these things let you engage with information in a much more fluid, much more plastic way than you did before. And of course, this is also the beginning of meme culture, right? People start to use internet memes where someone will record a video and then someone will edit it, right? We see so many variations on Rick Astley's Never Going to Give You Up, right? Like there are so many variations on that because people have the access to these tools to remix what's going on. Memes may not be essential to communities, but certainly the idea that there is this democratization of AV content is huge. And from the mid to late 2000s, from the mid 2000s or so, you saw a really interesting explosion in the adoption of smartphones and the development of what's called mobile first internet. Now, after the smartphones emerge, people start to design their technology, right? Their software specifically for phones as opposed to computers. This feels really obvious today, right? Most of the internet exists in your mobile phone. That was not the early internet, right? So this change from websites on desktop computers to apps and the move from desktop computers themselves to smartphones really transforms the internet in some really interesting ways that we need to talk about. And you see this in the growth of specific mobile-focused platforms. Instagram, WhatsApp, Snapchat being some of the iconic ones. And today you have things like TikTok, which is absolutely a mobile-based platform. And the idea is that this not only changes the technology you're using, but the nature of the contact, the nature of the communication. You always have your phone with you. So there's this constant contact. You're always online. Data is so ubiquitous, right? You have this constant information and you can interact with the community without needing to go sit down on your computer and do something. Instead, you can communicate with that community. You can connect with that community by clicking a button on your phone. That is a huge change in terms of how people engage with one another. And of course, in parallel to this, the influencer trend, which began in those early days of Web 2.0, really explodes, right? The widening and deepening communities from the early Web 2.0 become its own economy, become its own phenomenon in this era around the time of the mobile first period. And you start to see influencers who aren't just niche within their little communities, but they're able to develop a wider celebrity status, right? You see influencers who go from their TikTok videos to mainstream TV shows. You see people go from Instagram to modeling contracts, right? This wide celebrity status, moving from influencers to traditional celebrities. And at the same time, you see deepening niches. So you see people who not only are talking about video games, but are streaming very specific video games, giving strategy guides for very specific video games. And that happens, I mean, video games are an example, but it happens in the art world, it happens in politics, etc., right? You can get, because there is a much wider base of information, you can get people who get very, very narrow and specific in terms of the niche that they want to look at. And you start to see communities grow up focused on either individual influencers or groups, the expansion of platforms such as Patreon, tools such as the YouTube Red, right? These other tools that are emerging where people can follow specific users, follow specific communities in these ways that they couldn't before. And the Web 2.0, the prosumerism, and the mobile first really start to push this forward. And so the last phase of the internet that I want to talk about is Web 3.0. This is a cluster of trends that are loosely interconnected that are happening right now. So the first big trend that you're seeing in Web 3.0 is the decentralization of control. So with Web 2.0, everything got centralized to a few small platforms, few specific platforms. Facebook, Reddit, to a lesser extent, Tumblr, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, right? These kind of attracted all of the control, all of the access. And with Web 3.0, you're starting to see that decentralized. You're seeing intentionally private communities emerge in spaces such as Telegram, such as Mammoth, Blue Sky, on platforms such as Discord, where you can maintain your own private server. It's designed so that you're not seeing one monster platform where everybody's on it. You are intentionally having these small decentralized communities where people have more privacy and more control over what they're seeing and who sees what they're doing. In parallel with this decentralization, and in part driving this decentralization, is the idea of blockchain. And other encryption systems. So blockchain is kind of the most prominent of them, but there's a number of other privacy protections that come into play and become really important at this period. And the idea is that people's privacy and anonymity become so important at this point, right? People don't want Facebook to have all of the data about everyone and be able to share it everywhere. They want to have more control over their data and their information. And so they start to move to this very tightly encrypted spaces, which that encryption and that anonymity provides a lot more privacy and a lot more protected space than existed in the Web 2.0 era, right, which was so open. And then in parallel with this, you're seeing also a boom in AR and VR content and the metaverse. The idea is that the internet is becoming immersive, that you, in the same way that the move from computers to smartphone changed the way we interacted with the internet, because you no longer were dealing with a device that you had to go and access, but something you were carrying at all times in your pocket. The immersive internet potentially could transform the way we deal with the internet in that it's no longer something that you are looking at a screen to deal with, but it is something that exists in a virtual physical space around us. A little bit of weird wording, but you understand the idea that there's an immersive space around us, and we do not go to the internet, we enter the internet. And that could be a major change that we see in how people communicate over the internet in the near future. And then finally, the last kind of big Web 3.0 change, probably the one that most people are seeing in a visceral way right now, is the growth of AI algorithms and bots. So this automated content, right? Machines that are able to speak to humans, machines that are speaking to machines, and this huge boom in terms of how people are communicating and with what they are communicating. Now, all of a sudden, you need to consider that potentially bots are stakeholders and members in your community, right? That AI has a very important role to play in how you communicate among your members. And it's something really to consider in those terms. So I'll talk a little bit about some trends that you should be keeping in mind in terms of how communication has been transformed with the internet era. The first one is universal connectivity. So the fact that, as I said, everyone has a cell phone in their pocket, right? They are always online, and you can reach out and ask for communication with a click, which is a huge change in terms of how you can connect with people. Another step is the niche communities and influencers. So the idea that, first off, people can become celebrities out of very narrow interests, and you can find communities that are interested in extremely niche things. Someone who is fascinated by a specific type of model train set, who lived in the central US in 1980, might be able to convince one or two of their friends to join them. Today, they can find people who are passionate about that same train set in various parts of the US, different areas of the country, and also in Canada and Mexico, and also in South America, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, right? You have a global community that can sustain a critical mass around something that never could have had a critical mass before, right? No community is too niche to drive some kind of interaction on the internet. And that's a really interesting thing. And as I said, from this very, very niche interest, you can start to have influencers emerge, right? You can have communities that have leadership within them. Another big aspect is the idea of prosumerism and democratization. So famously, the internet democratizes information, but it also democratizes access to the tools to create information, right? To create content. And that is transformative in terms of leading communities, because every community member can now create material that speaks for your community, whether that's because they have access to Canva and they're able to create AV content, because they have a smartphone and they are willing to record video for you, because they have access to writing tools and they are willing to write for you, right? All of that is prosumerism, and it's very important in terms of how communities are going to run. It also means that you don't have control over who and how, who is creating content for you and how. So you need to consider who has a voice and why. The idea of anonymity and privacy, right? That people no longer need to show up in person and show their face to be part of your community. You can have a community where no one knows anyone, right? Where no one knows who's part of the community because everyone is anonymous. This has happened a lot with things like Anonymous, the name, the hacker collective, right? Where nobody knew who was in it because everyone was anonymous. Everyone was pseudonymous. And as the encryption, blockchain, other privacy tools become more and more robust, that will only get to be more and more prevalent, that people want privacy and anonymity in terms of participation in some communities. Frictionless mobile communication, I talked about this under universal connectivity, but the idea that with your mobile phone, there's no need to do a lot of work in order to communicate, right? It's totally frictionless. You can always interact with the community at a moment's notice, right? Very, very important to consider in terms of communities. Leaderless communities become very prevalent as well. The idea that along with that democratization of information, right, you no longer need one person who's going to set the agenda, declare things, make statements. You have the ability for anyone to access an asynchronous message board and share information about what they're doing. And the leaders are the people who take action and the people who step forward. There's no fixed or dedicated leader who needs to be involved in anything anymore. And that can really drive really interesting changes in the nature of communities. And although I've been discussing how important the internet is, let's keep in mind it's not real life, right? Especially post-COVID, you started to see a boom of hybrid and IRL spaces reemerging, right? That people are no longer content to only interact with each other online, and they place a real premium on being able to engage with people in a physical space together. Whether that means that you are organizing meetups or conferences, or if you are keeping your community intentionally to a physical place, those are things that people are increasingly seeking out, because for all of the power that the internet has, for all the power that online communication provides, and it's a lot, it doesn't replace physical contact. And that recognition, because of the shock of COVID, really came home to a lot of people. And we're seeing a lot of consideration of people wanting to take their communication offline in a very specific way. That certainly is a useful tool and an interesting one to consider. And the choice of being online or offline or hybrid should be one you make intentionally. So thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video.